To the Gaggle, where we challenge and, if necessary, destroy media narratives. I'm George Samueli. It is now 9:10 p.m. in a very, very grim Budapest. Days are getting extremely, brutally, bleakly short. Lights switched on in the middle of the afternoon. And I'm, of course, completely under the weather with this horrible fall allergies. So I may come across as a little weak because these fall allergies here are quite nasty. But on the positive note, thank you very much, everybody who has joined me. Really glad to see you. I hope everyone is well. And Ahmadovich says, "Yeah, it's a gray evening." Yeah, exactly. It is indeed a very, very gray evening. And Ahmadovich says the stupidity of Kaja Kallas about World War II is mind blowing. It seems the dumber you are, the higher position you get. Yes, it's very, very interesting. And this was this was tweeted out earlier today, in which Kaja Kallas expressed astonishment and was apparently aghast that the Russians were claiming that they had won World War II. She apparently thought that this was a complete, outrageous, ridiculous assertion, and claimed that this was reflective of the ignorance in which Russians lived. I don't know who the hell she thought did win World War II. I mean, what, Estonia? I mean, I don't know. I mean, Estonia was a particular case because, of course, it was occupied by the Red Army um, in 1940, and this is part of Stalin's very understandable tactical move to move the Soviet Union's border westward to give him room to maneuver in the event of the German attack that he was expecting. So that he took the three Baltic states, he took parts of Finland, and of course also took uh, the Poland. That was and then of course he took part of Romania, and now, of course, then the Germans attacked in 1941, so it pushed the Soviets out of Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia. But there was a very, very extensive collaboration in those three Baltic states. And then, of course, eventually the three Baltic states were liberated by the Red Army. And otherwise they would have continued to be under Nazi occupation. So it's very hard to understand what the hell Kaja Kallas is talking about. She's so blinded by her absolute, incredible, passionate hatred for the Russians that she really does go around making assertions that really Russia played a very minimal role in winning World War II. I mean, I guess she lives in this cocoon world and probably thinks that the winners of World War II were, the Germans. I mean, they were the winning team. Maybe the British, and maybe some of the Americans, but definitely not the Russians. Or maybe she thought the Russians were on the other side, and that the Russians had been defeated in World War II. It's very hard to know exactly what she's so stupid, and she's been promoted so far above her abilities, um, that it really is quite shocking. I mean, she gets paid an enormous amount of money, and it's worse than just her abilities. I mean, it's a reflection of the EU that it chose as its foreign policy person somebody who's so manifestly unqualified to be in that position, not just because of her ignorance, willful ignorance or whatever, but because of her bellicosity. I mean, she wants a war with Russia. I mean, you can't have as your foreign policy person somebody who craves war. Um, and then Akhmadovich says, sorry, as I say, it's this fall allergy. So says Akhmadovich says, Milorad Dodik stated today, if the situation in Bosnia and Herzegovina does not change, the Republika of Srpska will have no choice but to declare independence. And then you put in parentheses, can he do that now when it's so late? Or so late? Well, the answer is no, he can't. He should have done it a long time ago. He's been threatening to do this a long time ago. And he's been threatening now year after year after year. It's never been credible. And we've talked about it here a number of times that it really is quite pointless. If you go around making these charges that you intend to secede from Bosnia and Herzegovina, which I think is perfectly reasonable, and then you don't do it, then you're seen to be weak and the blowhard. Now, he's now in a very difficult position because he has been stripped of the post of president. He's not president of the Republika Srpska anymore. He doesn't have the title. It's not clear to me who actually governs Republika Srpska, because he still goes around calling himself president, and presumably he makes some decisions here and there. I don't know if he's still picking up a salary. I mean, it's a little like in Office Space, where somebody they let somebody go, but they kind of forgot to tell him, and then he just continued year after year to collect a paycheck. So in the same way, I don't know. He's not president any longer. He's been stripped of that title, but he seems still to be going around being president. I don't know if he's still getting a paycheck. He was in Hungary today in his capacity as president of the Republika Srpska, and he met the Hungarian foreign minister, who also doesn't recognize Dodik being stripped of his position. But the problem is he has been stripped of his position, so he really doesn't have executive powers. Now, if he were of a mind, I mean, he could confront NATO, he could confront Christian Schmidt, the high representative for Bosnia and Herzegovina, and take matters into his own hand and lead an armed revolt, declare the Republika Srpska as an independent state, and then wait for the authorities in Sarajevo, and with the assistance of NATO, to act against him, because they will use force against him. So he has that option. But he's not going to exercise that option because he hasn't exercised it up until now. And his alternative, well, he's going to hold a referendum. Okay, but he may hold a referendum. Probably, if he does hold a referendum, the authorities in Sarajevo and the Office of the High Representative will not seek a confrontation during the holding of the referendum, simply because they don't need to. They'll just say, look, you don't have the authority to hold, to declare a referendum. So therefore, there's no real point to it. They'll say, okay, fine, go ahead and do it. Has no legal validity because you have no legal validity. You're not president any longer. So it's all kind of empty talk. And he said, well, if things don't change, well, things aren't going to change. He has now been stripped of his position as president. That's it. It's a done deal. He had opportunities over the years. I mean, he's been basically president either of the Republika Srpska or the Republika Srpska's representative in the Bosnia Herzegovina presidency, either one or the other, since 1998. So now he's had 27 years in which to secede from Bosnia and Herzegovina, and he hasn't done it. Now, he um, it really is in a very tight spot. He's put Republika Srpska in a very tight spot because, as we discussed it when we had on Stefan Kaganovic about a couple of weeks ago, um, they're going to hold an election. There will be a new presidential election in the Republika Srpska sometime, I think, in late November. And there's no minimum vote that's needed in order to legitimate this election. So Dodik will doubtless say, well, the Serbs, we are all going to boycott this vote. We're not going to take part in this presidential election. And I'm sure that this boycott will be, no, if not 100%, let's say 90% of the Serbs in the Republika Srpska will boycott this presidential election, saying this is it's not legitimate. It wasn't legitimate stripping Dodik of the presidency, and they will boycott this vote. However, there is no minimum necessary. So 3 people can show up to vote, and that will be sufficient for whoever gets 2 out of 3 of those votes to be declared the new president of the Republika Srpska. Now, this new president will, I think, be a very accommodating figure, and he will do what the NATO powers have dreamt of since 1995 and the signing of the Dayton Accords, which is to liquidate the Republika Srpska. This is unfinished business from 1995. The NATO powers were very unhappy that they had to compromise. With NATO, it's all or nothing. So they were angry that they couldn't achieve a victory over the Serbs in that war, and they had to placate the Serbs by giving them half of Bosnia and Herzegovina. They didn't want to give them anything. The NATO goal, the American goal, had been basically a single unitary state of Bosnia and Herzegovina, largely dominated by the Muslims and the Croats. The Croats are always the German, who are always the proteges of the Germans, and the Muslims became the proteges of the Americans. So they would dominate the Bosnia and Herzegovina, and the Serbs would be a permanent minority. They would complain and this and that, but ultimately they would always be in a minority. That was the plan. But the Serbs fought very tenaciously with Karadzic and Mladic, and they got something. They didn't get everything that they wanted, which is they basically wanted to separate themselves from Bosnia and Herzegovina and join Serbia. They didn't get that, but they got half of Bosnia and Herzegovina. So NATO has been angry all this time, and they've been looking for 30 years to bring this Republika Srpska to an end. And I think now they may well be in a position to achieve that because, with Dodik gone and with no successor to Dodik on the horizon, there's no one here that, Dodik can say, okay, well, you've removed me from the presidency, but what about this guy? He's my my stand-in. There's no one around, so they'll probably find some Pashinyan-like character among the Serbs who will, basically liquidate the Republic of Srpska. He will do what the NATO powers have been um, seeking to do for a very long time. And I think that's in a way, Dodik has kind of been outmaneuvered, and he was outmaneuvered because he left it so late. He had his chances when he had power to move to leave Bosnia and Herzegovina. It was a high risk strategy, and it could have provoked a NATO intervention, but he didn't do that. He just talked and talked and talked and didn't really accomplish anything very much. And then they set a trap for him. Um, the West is very good at that. They're very good at setting traps. They did that in Ukraine. So it's either or. You either as in Ukraine, the situation for Russia was either you do nothing as NATO moves into Ukraine and scoops up Ukraine into NATO. You either do nothing, and that means you cease to be a great power, or you intervene militarily to bring this to an end, and then you've got a very difficult war on your hands, which could drag on for years and years, and has obviously an enfeebling, debilitating effect on Russia. So um, that's what they did in Ukraine. Now they did something similar in Bosnia and Herzegovina because Christian Schmidt um, adopted off his own bat this new legislation, just himself. That was just his decree. A foreigner, a German, just changed the criminal code um, in throughout Bosnia and Herzegovina, but that was also in the Republic of Srpska. So he changed the criminal code to say that it's now a criminal matter if anybody defies the will of Christian Schmidt. In other words, his decrees, should not only be adhered to, but to defy them is a criminal offense. So that was the trap. This was and the Serbs actually said, well, we can't allow that to be introduced into the criminal statute, and they said that we're not going to do that. We're not going to allow this to be written in to the criminal statute of the Republic of Srpska. So, of course, that was the crime. Hey, that's the crime. We just said it's now a crime to defy the will of the office of the High Representative, and now you have said that you will refuse to insert that in to the criminal code of the Republic of Srpska. Therefore, you are committing the very crime that Christian Schmidt had said that you cannot commit, and so therefore you will be prosecuted. And so Dodik was indeed prosecuted, and while he wasn't sent to prison, which wasn't what they wanted, that they couldn't care less whether they sent him to prison or not. So he wasn't sent to prison. He paid a fine, so he doesn't have to go to prison. But that it stays on the statute, and he's removed from the presidency. That's it. That was the trap. Whichever way it goes. If you do nothing, then essentially anything that the High Representative says or does must be obeyed, or you face criminal charges. You either leave that in your criminal code, or you say we're not going to put it into our criminal code, in which case, hey, you've committed the crime that Schmidt says you cannot commit. Therefore, you will be prosecuted. And that's it. It was quite a simple operation, and Dodik has been removed. So there's nothing Dodik can do now about seceding or anything else, unless he's willing to engage in a very serious confrontation with the authorities in Sarajevo, and therefore the authorities of NATO. It's risky. I don't know what NATO would do, but NATO may well use force against him. They did it before in the 90s, and NATO may well want to relive the glory days of the 90s. but just the things that Dodik is saying is just it isn't it doesn't indicate that he's willing to engage in this confrontation. In fact, he's offered recently, I think, to uh, take back his rejection of the change to the criminal code. To go back to the status quo ante. That isn't going to cut it. He's done, unfortunately. Anyway, let's go back. Where was there? Was got some interesting questions there. Yeah, just uh, and Vic Shakapopoulos says, George, what is your opinion on the Katyn massacre? What are the controversies around it? How do I use this? Okay. Let's go. This is what I'm. Yeah. Um, you know, the Katyn massacre is one of these things that I have to admit myself that it's always puzzled me. I've never found the official story plausible. Um, Simply because it didn't make very much sense to me why the Soviets would execute 20,000 Polish officers in 1940. No one's really ever given an explanation as to what the thinking was. The theory that's often put forward, oh well, they did it because they already were planning on creating a kind of a satellite state in Poland, and these Polish officers would have comprised the the resistance to Soviet or communist rule. Well, okay, it's a kind of a nice theory which you come up with after the fact, but it's hard to believe that in 1940 the Soviets were thinking about creating a kind of a Polish satellite state that they would dominate. In 1940, Hitler was riding high. The chances of the Soviet Union, um, having its own um, sphere of influence were kind of very, very dim. It was so there was not going to be a Polish state. I remember Hitler had taken um, much of Poland. Hitler had taken much of Poland, and he obviously he had redrawn the map, and then they had the uh, the governor general kind of Poland in the middle, and then you had the eastern part of Poland that was annexed by the Soviet Union. Now, you know, it's very hard for that Stalin was really thinking about what would happen um, once the Germans are gone, and and Poland would be would somehow be under Soviet domination. They couldn't have been thinking. In 1940, it was far from being obvious what the world would be like in 1945. So I don't get that story. Now the other story is that this was payback for the Polish Soviet War of 1920. Now there's a lot of bad feeling about that, and Stalin was obviously very much involved in that war. Soviets fought poorly, um, and there was without question there was some real nasty atrocities committed by the Poles on the Russians in that war. And there's a lot of bitterness, and there's clearly a lot of bad feeling, stemming from that Polish-Soviet war. So yeah, okay, payback, that's a possibility. But even with payback, 20,000 Polish officers executed in cold blood um, would seem to be somewhat excessive. So I don't find the um, the official story particularly plausible. Now, it's probably that the Germans did not commit this. I mean, that if the Germans had committed the Katyn massacre, then it's very unlikely that the Germans would have made a whole international incident out of this, and and called in the Red Cross, and then they had the whole exhuming the bodies and so on. I mean, if the Germans were responsible, then they wouldn't go to all this uh, this problem, unless the Germans were so thinking so elaborately in this kind of 5D chess that they were figuring, well, if we do this, and if we point the finger at the Soviets, this is going to cause real problems among the Allies, as of course it did, because the Poles, who and the Soviets and the British, they were all on the same side. This was in 1943 when they discovered this mass grave. So they were all on the same side, and of course the Poles started getting very agitated and started pointing fingers at the Russians, and the Russians naturally got angry about this, and they broke off relations with the British Poles. And this, of course, was very nice because then the Soviets could say, "Good, we don't need to worry about these people. We can just simply set up our own Poles, the ones who will do what we want them to do." But they would have done that anyway. I mean, they didn't need Katyn essentially to create their own group of people, group of Poles that they say these are the legitimate representatives of the Polish people. And of course, they're going to do that because the London Poles had been away for some time now. I mean, they really had no longer any roots in Poland, and therefore, the Soviets could come around and say, well, no, these people who are here in Poland, they're the real representatives of the Polish people. So that would have happened anyway. Um, so, long story short, I find the official story implausible, but that doesn't mean that I have a better story. There is a guy called Grover Furr who has written about Katyn, and I read his book, and I have to admit I didn't find that plausible. He seems to have an agenda, but um, he didn't come up with a very plausible story. Um, I mean, the problem is that there's so much of this the kind of official, um, the imprimatur of all of the Allied governments and all of the anti-Soviet and writers and historians, all of whom have closed the book on Katyn. That it's very hard to disentangle exactly what happened. I certainly find it not implausible that the various documents about Katyn that were supposedly uncovered during the Glasnost years, an order issued by Beria himself to execute these Polish officers, I could quite believe that this was a forgery, because it just seems too convenient. It's just too pat to be able to say, "Oh, look what we found." Um, this was at the time when all these the place had been thoroughly infiltrated by the Western intelligence services, and so there was absolute demand for all kinds of revelations and exposés of Soviet crimes, and then lo and behold, they find this document signed by Beria himself to execute these Polish officers. So I can quite believe that that was a forgery, but I haven't been able to put together an alternative, a plausible alternative. I mean, it would be interesting to find out whether there are any Russian scholars um, burrowing away who have called into question, because no one in the West is interested in calling this into question. But there may be some Russian scholars burrowing away who have called into question the various aspects of this of Katyn. Um, but that's it. I mean, as I say, just that I don't think that the official story, makes a great deal of sense. Let's see. Where is it? Um, let's see. Oh, Marty. Marty's got, Marty was worried earlier today that he's not going to have a good introductory meme, but he's got a fantastic introductory meme. This is a picture. I've never seen this picture. This is a picture of Kaja Kallas, the European Central Bank woman. Name just escapes me. Whatever her name is, and of course Ursula von der Leyen. So these three women doing the selfie. Is it Christina? Is it Christina Lundgren? I can't remember the exact name of her. Now, we had an interesting posting with Ursula von der Leyen when she was younger. I mean, and I thought when I first saw that this was Ursula von der Leyen, a younger one, she looked a little like Kaja Kallas. I thought, oh, this is Kaja Kallas. It's funny, it hadn't really occurred to me. The Lagarde, yeah, Christiane Lagarde, that's right. She was, I mean, you remember when she, it was one of those meetings that Trump attended during his first term. Was it the G7? I don't know. I mean, there's so many. I think it was a G7 meeting, and Trump brought along his daughter, absolutely insufferable daughter Ivanka, and then there was the cocktail party, and so it was either was it G7 or G20? I don't know. I can't remember. Anyway, there was the cocktail party, and as you're supposed to do in cocktail parties, people mingle, and so there was this group of people, standing there with their drinks in their hands. Theresa May, Justin Trudeau, Emmanuel Macron, Christiane Lagarde, and then Ivanka, and then Ivanka, just does what you'll often do when you're not really very important yourself, and you're suddenly in a group of people who are important. You talk too much. She just found that, hey, all these the prime ministers, presidents, and here I am mixing with them, and so she just blabbed and blabbed and blabbed, and but Christiane Lagarde looked with this real disgust. I mean, just watch her face. She really does look like she's just eaten a lemon, and because she was just so angry that she, such an important person, head of the European Central Bank, and Theresa May, UK Prime Minister, and President of France and Prime Minister of Canada, should have to sit and listen to this nonsensical babble from this whippersnapper of a girl. And her look, the disgust on her face, was just quite striking. And I have to say that it was one of the few times in life when I took the side of Ivanka Trump. I like the fact that she made um, Christian Lagarde look with so disgusted. Um, it's typical that it's a woman who would do this. It's only a woman who would feel this disgust for another woman, because Macron and and Justin Trudeau, they were just polite. I mean, obviously they thought this was inappropriate for this, young girl to be talking to these really important people, but they were polite and they listened and smiled, drank their drink. It wouldn't have occurred to them to look with the disgust that Lagarde looked. So, um, anyway, but so that's what but I was also very happy that Lagarde was completely taken in by those pranksters, the whatever their names, I've forgotten. Those Russian pranksters, totally taken in by them, which had always puzzled me because they don't really sound um, very very Russian. Um, anyway, I just I forgot. I don't know why. I'm always having difficulties when I try to um, maneuver this page. Um, um, no, this is not it either. Let me just. All right. So then Robert says Chris Christie is back in the news, courtesy of DJT. Yes, that's right. Um, and so that we have the Katyn. Um, um, Essay Dillendan talks about it's a crime to refuse a painting from Titorelli. I think he's always bringing up this Titorelli. Now, Titorelli was this this strange artist in Kafka's The Trial, and he, as the world begins to close in on Joseph K. And let me just get this out of the way. Joseph K. He's told, why don't you go see this guy Titorelli? He's a painter. Why should I go and see a painter? He asks. Oh, well, he really knows all the workings of the law. Okay, so he goes to see this Titorelli, and he doesn't tell him anything. He basically just blabs and blabs without really saying anything. And so Joseph K. decides, well, it's you might as well go. I'm not learning anything. And then before he goes, Titorelli says, well, I better give you a present. And then Kay says, yeah, I don't really need a present. So, here's a painting. All right, well, thank you very much. Well, let me give you another present. I don't need another present. He gives him, that's another painting. And he looks at the painting. It's exactly the same. Just the second painting is exactly the same as the first painting. He says, all right, well, I think I'll go now. And then he goes, oh, here's another painting. This is the third painting. Exactly the same as the first two paintings. And then so it goes on. It just gives him painting after painting. All of them are exactly the same. And I think that moment it just adds to the whole nightmare of this situation where he sees this artist, and this artist over and over and over again, he keeps painting the same painting. Anyway, let's before we get on to a few things, let me just take a look at some of the other points made by Gagglers. And let me go. Where are we? So Danaki, always very good to see you. Sorry, Danaki, that you keep having problems with locals, making payments to locals. I don't really understand it. Anyway, Danaki says, Kedvesh George, dear George, what do you think are the chances of their invoking Trump's health or whatever to usher in President Eyeliner. I am Peter Thiel's and the techno brass pupil, um, which may have been the plan all along. Actually, I don't know. I mean, it's an interesting theory, uh, but on the other hand, um, I don't know that Trump has really in any way threatened the powers that be really seriously. Um, for all the talk about how he was going to leave NATO, that's never that's not going to happen. He's going to abandon Ukraine. That isn't going to happen. Um, and so the other things like that he's done, like bombing Iran, like, no one's terribly upset about that. Getting into completely in bed with Netanyahu in Gaza. Okay, no, that's not a problem. So I haven't seen any reason so far that the powerful interests would decide to remove him and replace him with Vance. Also, to be honest, I think it would be harder to do in his case than it was with Biden. I mean, and I have to say that back in 2024, um, many people said, "Oh, I think Biden will be replaced by somebody else." And I was very skeptical of that. I continually said, "I don't think you can do it because if Biden refuses to go, then Biden refuses to go. There's nothing really you can do about it." And Biden did refuse to go until until really very late in the game. By which time I think it was already too late to remove him. I mean, it doesn't seem like the Democrats really got anything for removing Biden at such a late stage. It was in July of 2024, but it was an easier um, to do in the case of Biden because he was already almost in a vegetative state. So it wasn't really clear to what extent he even understood what was going on around him. Um, though one has to say that the exact circumstances of the removal of Biden have never really been fully explained. I mean, I don't it we don't know exactly how this was done. Um, I mean, it was a coup without question. It was an absolute coup. But exactly how they did it and how they managed to um, essentially get Biden to go along with it, that still remains a mystery, and that hasn't been explained. What happened during that weekend when Biden going into the weekend, Biden absolutely says, "No, I'm not going anywhere," and then lo and behold, within 48 hours, he says, "I'm off," and I'm handing everything over to Kamala. So I don't know exactly what happened there, but I think either way, Trump would be a very difficult person to push out of the way, and particularly as he's a one-term president. So there's no, if the Republicans were in the same way as the Democrats, Republicans were kind of looking to, but Trump was going to head the ticket in 2028, and then they were thinking in terms of, oh, we're heading for an absolute debacle, just as with Biden, and they say we need to remove uh, Trump. But since they know Trump is not going to head the ticket in 2028, so there's no great urgency um, to remove him. And his poll numbers, while not exactly great, are not catastrophic either. So there's not, he hasn't in any way sunk into the really disastrous numbers that Biden sank to, and he's nowhere near on the sort of the poll numbers that Macron or Trudeau before his departure, or uh, Merz, or Starmer. So, he's doing okay. He's underwater, but if your popularity rating is still above 40%, you got to enjoy, say, 43% approval rating. That isn't bad. That isn't really a disaster. Um, anyway, Danaki says, and secondly, does anybody ask themselves why there have been no more Tel Aviv buses blown up by Hamas in broad daylight like 20 years ago? I mean, if they could penetrate the security fence like nobody was watching, gee, really nobody was watching it right then, they surely could blow up anything, anywhere, any day in Israel, right? Um, yeah, I, I don't know. It is interesting that they did all of those things. They don't do them um, anymore um, in Israel, and they haven't done more of that kind of thing in I mean, after September, no, October the 7th. They haven't really done anything very much. I mean, they fought a defensive war, and they fought back against Israel, but they haven't really taken the fight to Israel. I mean, in the way, say, Iran did. I mean, Iran attacked Israel. Iran used its missiles to attack Israel proper. Even the Houthis have done that. Houthis have launched missile attacks on Israel. So the strange thing is, Hamas really hasn't done anything after October the 7th other than fight back in Gaza. And so they've allowed Israel to do the uh, to just pretty much dictate the terms of the war, which itself is quite interesting. Why haven't they done more? Why haven't they um, forced Israel to pay a heavier price? Now, of course, you say, oh well, if that had happened, Israel would use its almighty military to smash, crush, do terrible things to Gaza. But of course, they've already done that. I mean, they do that anyway. So I don't know what more could Israel do against Gaza in those circumstances. So it is very odd that they haven't really done anything like that in any way. They haven't taken the war to Israel since October the 7th, and they've just gone on essentially allowing Israel to dictate the terms of the conflict. Now, so as to what happened on October the 7th, well, I guess we're going to need to find out. But in order to find out, Netanyahu has first got to leave, and he doesn't seem like he has any interest in going. And so, as long as he's there, as long as the war goes on, then there's going to be no official inquiry as to what really happened on October the 7th. I mean, no question. Um, the official story does not make sense. There's just no way that Hamas could just simply waltz into Israel just like that. Um, it's never happened before. How they could do it, we don't know. But as long as the war goes on, there's no official inquiry, so we're none the wiser. Anyway, then Danaki says, plus Trump tells European coalition of the reassurance to stop buying Russian oil for real this time. 26 countries pledging 30,000 soldiers. I guess Kinjals will be flying into NATO bases any minute now. Escobar. Yes, sir. Yeah, that's right. But Trump really, I mean, we have that today, and we'll talk about it in a minute. What about this? There was a coalition of the willing meeting in Paris today, and Trump called in, or rather, they wanted Trump to call in, but it doesn't look as if Trump made any more commitments today to support this coalition of the willing forces in Ukraine than he's ever done. He leaves it vague, other than, as you say, Danaki, he said, hey, you got to stop buying oil. You got to stop buying oil and gas. He said, and that's why, and then he goes off in his spiel. I've been telling the Europeans to stop buying oil and gas for years and years, and they all made fun of me, and I stopped Nord Stream, and then Biden started up Nord Stream, and so on and so forth. But the problem with that is quite a kind of interesting, because who is the main purchaser of oil in Europe, Russian oil in Europe? Well, it's Hungary and Slovakia, who are, I guess, Trump's best allies in Europe, because they get their oil by pipeline. And the EU gave an exemption to those European countries that receive their oil from Russia via pipeline. If you got your oil by sea, then you were told to cut yourself off from Russian oil, and that's what they did. Other than getting it through third parties, but in terms of who's getting oil directly from Russia today, then it's Hungary and Slovakia. And Hungary in particular said, we're not going to change this, at least not in the near future, because we don't really have any means to do so. Our refineries are built to refine Russian crude. We can't just simply convert them to handle any other kind of oil. And so he made that clear. And the alternative, which is getting our oil from the Adriatic through Croatia on trucks, that's a huge, very expensive undertaking. So Hungary has said, no, we're going to continue getting our oil via the Druzhba pipeline, even though Ukraine keeps attacking it, and Slovakia much the same. So Trump is kind of, attacking his own allies there, which is kind of odd. And then Trump also pressured Orban to withdraw his objections to Ukraine's membership of the EU. Now, Orban has staked his political reputation on his implacable opposition to Ukraine's membership of the EU. He said, no, there's no way Ukraine will join the EU. He had a referendum. He even held a referendum on the subject. Admittedly, it was online. Overwhelmingly, was a vote against Ukraine's membership. But Trump got on the phone to Orban and said, well, why don't you withdraw your objections? Why don't you allow Ukraine in? So let's kind of put Orban in a bit of a tight spot. So Trump hasn't really done very much to help out Orban, despite the fact that he makes reference to him in every speech about this fantastic tough guy in Hungary, who's always said that the way we're going to have peace is if Trump returns to the White House. Well, Trump returned to the White House, and we don't really have peace, and Trump doesn't seem to know how to get to peace. Anyway, thank you so much, Danaki. And then Robert, thank you, Robert. Robert says, journalists now say Russia is suspected of blatant interference with Ursula's plane's GPS. But if it's blatant, you don't suspect it, you know it. The phrasing, the logic, the politics, and the fact that she even has a plane seems all wrong on all levels. I agree with you. And to be honest, I'm noticing that the journalists are kind of dropping that story. There's the article today in Politico, which seems to be kind of hedging its bets and saying, well, maybe the Russians really weren't behind this GPS attack. So they're not really pushing the GPS story as hard as they might. It's a little like the Nord Stream, when the Nord Stream pipeline was blown up, and yeah, the usual people rushed out within hours. Oh yeah, of course the Russians did it. The Russians did it. They blew up the pipeline, but you very quickly the word went out, probably from official sources, and then the journalists kind of realized, okay, we better drop this story, and in fact, drop the whole story. Um, and I think something like this is happening with GPS. The Financial Times made a big to do about it on Monday, but there hasn't been much since Monday. And as I say, today's Politico seem to be pouring cold water on the theory that the Russians had anything to do with it. I mean, so it would be a bloody silly thing in any way to cause Ursula von der Leyen's plane to crash. I mean, that would be very, very foolish, and there'd be very little purpose to it, because whoever takes over from von der Leyen would be very much the same as von der Leyen. So it didn't really make very much sense, just from the point of view, as a strategic decision on the part of the Russians. But funnily enough, I actually thought that the Russians were behind the assassination of Andrei Parubi. I thought, okay, well, that has to be the Russians. There was this guy. They knew Parubi was involved in Maidan. They knew Parubi was involved in the Odessa fire, and Putin has repeatedly threatened that he would wreak vengeance on the people involved in Odessa. And so, yeah, that has to be the Russians who were behind this. But now it doesn't look as if it was the Russians, which I have to say is kind of pathetic. I think they should have taken Parubi out years ago. In fact, they should have taken a lot of the people out years ago. Putin makes this threat. He made that threat in 2022. We know everybody who was involved in the Odessa massacre, and we will deal with them. I thought, fantastic. And deal with them, but it hasn't happened. And so now it doesn't even look like the Russians were involved in this one. And certainly the authorities in Ukraine are not accusing the Russians of being involved in this Parubi assassination. So as I say, I think the GPS story doesn't seem to be doesn't seem to have much legs. I mean, no one's really pushing this very hard. And then Robert says this is the Chris Christie versus Pritzker. Yeah, that looks brutal. Chris Christie versus Pritzker, the two sumo wrestlers. So that's a nice meme. Anyway, Cynthia, always very good to see you, Cynthia. And so Cynthia says, what Trump did to the alleged drug boat reminds me of what Biden did to an alleged spy balloon. They both probably had a benign object totally demolished in order to leave no trace of its harmlessness. If so, what they both did was definitely done by using disproportionate force, though it's not known how many millions were spent to take out a small speedboat. I'm sure about the same millions were spent to take out a balloon that isn't worth more than $100 at best. I don't know. The spy balloon thing was I think was a little different, because the problem with that was that the Chinese really were not being cooperative. Now, they can say it's a weather balloon. Oh, it's just a weather balloon, and it's benign, and maybe it was, but nonetheless, it was now flying over the United States. It's obviously flying over strategic assets of the United States. So at this stage, if let's say if we go with the Chinese official story, which is that it's a weather balloon that had blown off course, then it would be up to the Chinese, really, to cooperate with the Americans, either to bring down that balloon, or if they're unable to bring it down, then to cooperate with the Americans uh, to blow it out of the sky. But ultimately, you can't expect the Americans just to take a take it on trust from the Chinese. Oh, this is just simply a weather balloon that's blown off course. You're onto a hiding to nothing when something like that happens, and you have to then cooperate and say, look, we understand you're not happy about this balloon flying over, your strategic assets, possibly taking pictures, and whatever. We're going to help. Let's work together to bring this balloon down. The Chinese didn't do that. So I have to say, no fan of Biden. I did understand why after this refusal to cooperate on the part of the Chinese, they decided to take out this balloon, but nobody was killed. Now, the case of the drug boat, or the alleged drug boat, I think seems much more dubious than the case of the spy balloon, because um, if the U.S. Naval vessels was suspicious and thought that this was a drug boat, and they were delivering whatever, cocaine or fentanyl, either in the Caribbean to Trinidad and Tobago, or this was heading towards the United States. I mean, whatever they're thinking about it, then essentially you do what you're supposed to do, which is you do an interdiction. You interdict a boat you suspect is transporting drugs, and you shoot only in circumstances that in which they they attempt to resist. They refuse to allow the boat to be boarded, and then they start shooting, and then you fire. You use lethal force, since they had initiated this the use of the lethal force. Now, as far as we know from the story, in this case, the U.S. just simply started shooting, and the story is, well, they killed 11 people. Now, you can't really do that. I mean, it's like, in any policing operation, you can't just simply say, well, these are bad guys, and they're involved in drug running, and they're better off dead anyway. So why don't we just simply take them out, and we kill them? I mean, that doesn't really work in any policing. I mean, you can only, supposedly, you can only use lethal force if the suspected criminal refuses to be cooperate with police force, and then begins shooting or whatever. Then it's justified to use lethal force. But there's no evidence here that this boat was refusing to cooperate. So maybe he was involved in drug smuggling, but we haven't seen evidence of this. And the U.S. naval vessel killed 11 people. And we don't know who these 11 people. I mean, were all these 11 people involved in drug smuggling? I don't know. I mean, there might have been a cook on board who had no idea what the hell was going on this boat. So it's very hard. In this case, I think it's very hard to justify the use of lethal force. So you can say, okay, the United States or anybody else may have an interest in apprehending boats involved in the smuggling of drugs, whether drugs into Trinidad and Tobago, or drugs into the United States, or drugs anyway. Okay, they have an interest in stopping this, but you do it in a way in which this is a proper policing operation. I mean, you attempt to board the vessel, make arrests, and so on. I mean, you don't just start shooting before you've really ascertained even that this boat is carrying these drugs. I mean, you don't know. I mean, how can you establish any of that? And just simply blow a boat out of the water. I mean, you got to kind of find out what the hell is actually on the boat, and presumably, if you arrest them, and they really are drug runners, then presumably in the subsequent investigation, you will learn a little more about the whole drug running operation. So the story, the Trump story, it certainly doesn't make a great deal of sense, and to the extent that it doesn't reflect at all well um, on Trump. So I think that I would distinguish that from the spy balloon case. I think the Chinese kind of brought that on themselves by refusing to be cooperative. I mean, the Chinese wouldn't tolerate an American spy balloon flying over, their nuclear facilities and say, "Oh, that's okay. That's just a weather vane, a weather balloon is just blown off course." I mean, nobody would tolerate it. They say, "Well, I'm sorry, but we don't know what the hell that is." Either you tell us its exact coordinates or its flight pattern, or you basically, ideally, you bring it down, or we just shoot it out of the air. I mean, but nobody would just simply tolerate it and accept the story that it's just a benign weather balloon. Anyway, thank you so much, Cynthia, and then Cynthia goes on. At least there was no murder involved in the Biden's case. Yep, that's absolutely right. Involving the alleged spy balloon, which certainly can't be said about Trump's case involving the alleged drug boat. Yeah, absolutely right. So it is clearly shaping up to look like Trump may indeed have already outdone Biden when it comes to ordering murderous acts on behalf of the United States. Oh, I think that's right. The interesting thing case is that. What's really behind all of this? Is this is Trump really wants to take on the drug smuggling? Is that this big thing that he wants to get involved with, or is this all about going after Maduro? Is he trying to intimidate Maduro? Is he trying to make Maduro think about, hey, maybe I should step down and leave the country because Trump, this is the sort of the madman theory. Trump is, he might do anything. He could do anything. He could, he kills 11 people just like that in the Caribbean. What if he attacks Venezuela? He might kill some people in Venezuela, including the president. So this whole thing may just be about trying to intimidate Maduro. It's a regime change operation rather than an attempt to go after the drug lords. And to be honest, I do think that the whole idea of going after um, the drug lords is misbegotten. It's not going to work. I mean, other presidents have tried this, and none of them has succeeded. So this is going to be, if Trump really wants to do that, I don't think he's going to succeed. If he wants to affect regime change in Venezuela, that's a possibility. That one shouldn't discount the possibility that he could succeed there. I mean, he could bribe people around Maduro. He could bribe some militaries, whether it's generals or lower rank officers. He could bomb Caracas. He could bomb anything in Venezuela in an attempt to force him out of power. So that's a possibility that might succeed. It's wholly contrary to the platform that he ran on. I mean, remember, he ran on the platform: no more regime change, no more color revolutions, um, no more of these forever wars. So this would be the exact opposite of all of that. But I don't think Trump has ever really cared that much about consistency. So that I think is a more plausible than he's going to engage in this drug war that I think is not going to win. That it's all really about trying to get rid of Maduro. Anyway, let's go on. Anyway, thank you so much, Cynthia. And as I always say, um, Cynthia is our resident film expert, our film scholar. And so whenever we have our movie screenings on Monday, but they're posted on the Gaggle locals board. So if you can't make it to the screening on Monday, then you can see the film anytime. And as you watch the film, please do read Cynthia's extraordinarily erudite and knowledgeable commentary. So much fascinating background information. It's a real treasure, and we're very fortunate to have her here on the Gaggle. So thank you so much for all of that, Cynthia. And then, so there's, and Robert says, and weren't the mass graves in the Katyn forest discovered by the Nazis? Yeah, that's what I was saying earlier. That was the whole point, that they discovered it, which would suggest that they weren't the ones who were culpable. They discovered it, and then they called in the International Red Cross. Suddenly the Germans were indignant, horrified by the sight of this massacre. So they called them in, and the Poles immediately started accusing the Soviets of having perpetrated this immediately. And Stalin's position was, no, this was the Nazis who did this. The Nazis are just trying to smear us. They're trying to cause dissent among the Allied powers. Churchill told the Poles to knock it off. I think there's just no point in making a big deal out of this, because you're just going to cause problems with the Soviets. The Poles, of course, being Poles, they didn't knock it off, and they continued talking about Katyn until an infuriated Stalin broke off all diplomatic relations with the London Poles. Now, as I said earlier, I think he would have done that anyway. But this provided him with an excuse. Well, we're not interested in the London Poles. We're going to have our own Poles, and these will be the representatives of the Polish people. Later on in 44, 45, Stalin said, okay, well, we'll have a coalition government in Poland, and we'll bring it, some of these London Poles can come in and join up with our Lublin Poles. And they came, and of course, as soon as they arrived, the London Poles, they were immediately arrested. So there was never really any prospect of a serious coalition government. But I don't think that I don't think the Nazis would have done that if they were responsible. So I don't, now what were the circumstances exactly that of this killing? That doesn't really. That's the part that I don't exactly understand, and I don't know the the forensic details. Just I mean, the story of the 20,000 deaths just seems always too high. I mean, just seems far too many. 20,000 Polish officers. That's an awful lot of Polish officers. So I think it remains a kind of a mystery. Because if that it was indeed done by the Soviets, then you have to know, why did they do it? What was the motive? So I think the two motive, which is they were thinking about the post-war Poland. They needed to remove the people who would resist Soviet rule in post-war Poland. That doesn't make any sense, because in 1940 nobody was thinking along those lines. And then bad feelings arising out of the Soviet-Polish War of 1920. I think that was already a long time. 20 years had elapsed. Many of the people who were involved in that Soviet-Polish War, had moved on to other things. So it's unlikely that they were really so determined to carry out this revenge killing. So that's why I don't know. I mean, the story, as told, doesn't make a great deal of sense, but the alternatives don't make much sense either. And and Steve K9 says in America, the 19th Amendment was the beginning of the end. Well, I think it's you have a point. I mean, it's the 19th Amendment, which of course gave women the vote, and and it's it happened relatively late in many countries. I mean, it happened relatively late in Great Britain, 1918, 1928. And so, yeah, I mean, one would have to say these people, these political leaders that Europe has thrown up, they're an extraordinarily terrible group of people. I mean, they're blood blood chillingly horrific, violent, sadistic, psychopathic, um, and in a way, I mean, it just is very, very frightening that these people have got themselves at the very top. And I have to say, some of it is also true in the United States. That doesn't mean there aren't any terrible men who are at the top in the United States, but these creatures like Madeleine Albright was one of the worst. This is Madeleine Albright was probably the worst U.S. Secretary of State ever, and that includes Hillary Clinton. I mean, she was just rabid, absolutely rabid on the subject of the Serbs. She just wanted to wipe all the Serbs off the face of the earth. And then, Hillary Clinton, terrible person. I mean, I mean, there's, and then you had that awful, the Bushwoman, Condoleezza Rice. It's depressing even to think about that. And then Vic says, what is, in your opinion, the best and the worst decade of film? I say the 60s and 70s were the best, and the 80s were the worst. Well, it's a good question. I think the 70s were definitely a very good decade. I'd say the 60s was a mixed bag. I think that there were some very good films made in the 60s. I mean, all the various films we've talked about, the Doctor Strangelove, The Spy Who Came In From the Cold, and so they're really, really strong films. Also, a lot of terrible films. The films that tried to capture the 1960s zeitgeist, they were absolute embarrassment. I mean, they've really, really dated. This whole the hippie culture, the counterculture, and all that. I mean, those are terrible films. And Peter Sellers made a number of those films. Just awful, awful things. And now are embarrassing, like What's New Pussycat. These are terrible films. So I think it's a. So I think the 60s was the. Is the 80s terrible? I think it may be. I mean, if I'm trying to think of the good films of the 1980s, I mean, there were one or two. I mean, and we've screened them here at the Gaggle. I mean, we had The Return of Martin Guerre. It's a good film. That was 1982. But when we think of the 1980s, unfortunately, we think of the Brat Pack films in America, and then those kind of soap opera-ish, dating in New York. There was just so many of those rubbishy films that were made in the 80s. But then if I think of the 90s, I have difficulties thinking of any good films from the 1990s. I can think of a few from the 80s, but I have difficulties thinking any good films of the 1990s. So I think I would agree with you. The 1970s was a very strong decade. I say the 1940s and 50s were also a strong decade. 60s, I'd say, was a mixed bag. And then it kind of got pretty bad. I think the 80s was mostly pretty bad, but with a few exceptions. But I'd be hard put to think of too many good films in the 90s. So um, anyway, so thank you for that question. And then Samba Petros, thank you so much. Good to see you again. It says interesting about Katyn. I have no idea either. I mean, it's one of those things that it would be great if we could have some serious scholarly research. As I say, the only person that I've read is this kind of an obscure academic is this guy Grover Furr on Katyn. He kind of calls into question the official story, but he doesn't really have very much, to be honest. And to be honest, it is hard. I mean, the archives are not exactly open and accessible, so it's really quite difficult to do a thorough research. But maybe somebody in Russia that I don't know about who has done some serious work on this. I'd be really interested. If anybody knows of anyone in Russia who has been engaged in this kind of research, I'd be really interested. Anne Marie, it's very, very good to see you. Thank you so much, as always, for your generosity. Anne Marie is, as I've said before, our resident expert on classical music. Knows an enormous amount on classical music. Is a distinguished musician herself. Played in some of the outstanding orchestras of the world. Worked with some of the outstanding musical talents and outstanding composers and musical figures of the 20th century and the 21st century. And of course, she's regularly provides very learned and insightful commentary on the pieces that we run in the Gaggle Music Club. So it's really, really an honor to have her and to have her provide her informed commentary. So really appreciate it. Thank you so much, Anne Marie. And in the time remaining, let me just go through the Putin. He gave a news conference in Beijing, and he said one or two things that I thought were quite interesting. So here we have, he's asked. You often speak, and yesterday, by the way, this is a Russian journalist asked him, by the way, you also spoke about the root causes of the Ukrainian crisis when the country began to be dragged into NATO. But now we see that European leaders who declare and discuss certain guarantees, security guarantees for Ukraine, are almost entirely concentrating on the topic of deploying their troops in Ukraine. At the same time, many continue to insist on Ukraine's accession to the EU. But we also see that the European Union is rapidly, before our eyes, transforming from a former economic union into something like a military political bloc with aggressive decisions and aggressive statements almost constantly. And as we've discussed earlier, it's the EU president is Ursula von der Leyen, and the foreign policy person is Kaja Kallas. So yeah, the European Union has become this belligerent, aggressive military political bloc. And then Putin says, then the question, how can you comment on these layouts? And then Putin says, I agree with those who believe that each country has the right to choose its own system of ensuring its own security. This applies to all countries, including Ukraine, but this also means that the security of one party cannot be ensured at the expense of the security of the other party, in this case, the Russian Federation. We have always objected to Ukraine being a member of the North Atlantic Bloc, but we have never questioned its right to engage in its economic and business activities as it wishes, including its membership in the EU. Now, this is kind of interesting that he's now presented it in this way, because the question is quite pertinent. Because that was okay when you said that, let's say 25 years ago, You could say, okay, well, there's the EU and there is NATO, and the EU is mainly a political economic bloc. NATO is a military bloc. NATO is really led by the United States, and it's a military alliance directed at Russia. Whereas the EU is just, is basically, it's about internal markets. It's, and so on. And I think that was a reasonable argument to make some years ago, but now the EU and NATO are inseparable. Now, I know that there are members of the EU that are not members of NATO, and there are members of NATO that are not in the EU. So, for instance, Turkey is a member of NATO. And I mean, I'm not talking about Canada and the United States, obviously, but just in terms of the Eurasian continent, Turkey is a member of NATO, not in the EU. But then you have, members of the EU that are not in NATO, such as the Republic of Ireland and Austria. So, but by and large, the EU and NATO are now inseparable. NATO is the armed force of the EU. And when you listen to Ursula von der Leyen and you listen to Kaja Kallas, without question, they see this is an existential matter for the EU. The EU has to do everything in its power to fight Russia against, to fight Russia on behalf of Europe. That somehow Ukraine is the most important issue for the EU. So where is all the political, economic stuff, all the the internal markets and the deregulation and the sort of energy integration and all the stuff that EU is supposed to be about? This EU, sees itself as as primarily a force fighting Russia and fighting Russia in Ukraine. So it's very hard to see what Putin's talking about here. Because if Ukraine joins the EU and says, okay, well, we're not going to be a part of NATO, and even then, I don't know exactly how they would work this out to make sure that the Ukraine doesn't become a de facto member of NATO. But let's say, they impose all these limits on whatever forces, foreign forces that can be stationed there. I don't believe for 1 minute NATO would agree to adhere to any of those promises. But even if it happened, being a member of the EU, an EU led by von der Leyen and Kaja Kallas, that make you a part of a belligerent anti-Russian bloc. And frankly, it's going to be it's going to work against Russia. I mean, it'll be day and night. It'll be working against Russia. Now, maybe Putin sees this as a bargaining chip in the upcoming negotiations. So in other words, he's going to have to make some concessions. So he's thinking in terms of, okay, well, what concession can I make that actually won't matter so much? And he may think, well, okay, let's say I withdraw my objections to Ukraine's joining the EU, because in any case, Ukraine won't join the EU because there'll be too many other countries, member states of the EU, who will say, we don't want Ukraine. I mean, Hungary obviously has said, we're not going to support Ukraine's membership. Now, we'll see how much influence Trump will exert over Orban on that question. But I find it hard to believe that Poland will simply blithely accept Ukraine's membership in the EU. I'm not even sure France would go along with it. All these big agricultural countries, agriculture is a big deal for their economies, will just go along with Ukraine with all their cheap and crappy produce being dumped onto the European markets. It's not gonna be that easy. And so maybe that's what Putin is counting on, is saying, oh yeah, well, we don't have a problem, but it's not going to mean very much because Europe is never going to agree to have Ukraine as a member. Well, we'll see. We'll see about that. Um, I mean, these people in the EU, they're kind of off their rockers. I mean, they're so filled with hatred for Russia that they are willing to really, endure, you know, serious blows to their economies just in order to hurt Russia. Anyway, and then he goes on, and then there's another question. When Russia and the US are now discussing their efforts to peacefully settle Ukraine, the formula of security guarantees in exchange for territories is increasingly heard. Does this correspond to what you discussed with Trump in Alaska? And what do your words mean when you said that Russia is ready to join in the development of these guarantees? Who should be the guarantor, in your opinion? And if you allow me, about Zelensky, is there any point in meeting with him now in the current conditions? Is it possible to work out some agreements at this meeting? Okay, so kind of interesting questions. And then Putin says, the first part, once again, US efforts, there are currently some speculations that there is a formula of security guarantees in exchange for territory. And Putin says, no, we have never put the question that way or discussed it that way. Well, that's a bit. I don't know. That's the way the media have reported it. That basically the West says, all right, we'll accept the loss of some territories. De facto, not de jure, but de facto, we've lost some territories. Maybe even Ukraine will withdraw from some territories in Donetsk. Leave things as they are in Kherson and Zaporozhye, but in exchange, we issue security guarantees to Ukraine. That's at the moment the position of the coalition of the willing. So Putin says, well, no, we've never put the question that way or discussed it that way. Security guarantees are natural. I often talk about this. We proceed from the fact that any country should have these guarantees, a security system, and Ukraine is no exception. But this is not connected with any exchanges, especially with territorial exchanges. All right, so that is kind of baffling. And then he goes, we, frankly speaking, and I want to emphasize this, we are fighting not so much for territories as for human rights and for the right of people who live in these territories to speak their own language, to live within the framework of their culture and within the framework of traditions that have been passed down from previous generations, from their fathers, from their grandfathers, and so on. That's primarily what we are talking about. This is really very, very puzzling because as of September 2022, Russia has claimed the entirety of the oblasts of Donbass, Lugansk, Kherson, and Zaporozhye as part of the Russian Federation. They're part of the Russian Federation. In other words, Russian law, Russian constitution applies to these oblasts, including Crimea. So this becomes very confusing when he says, well, we're fighting with the rights of the people to speak their own language, live within the framework of their culture. I mean, you can say that, well, that's the reason why we have incorporated them within the Russian Federation. But nonetheless, it's a little bit of a convoluted argument because essentially it's still going to be a territorial shift. I mean, you're not prepared to accept the um, the transfer of these territories to Ukraine in exchange for commitments by Ukraine to respect the language and culture and the religious practices of those people. I mean, so it's kind of confusing way of putting it, because basically Russia's now said, for whatever reason, said they are incorporated within the Russian Federation. So that's a done deal, at least according to the Russian government position. It's a done deal. So to start talking about, well, we're not really concerned about that territory, we're concerned with language and so on, that just adds confusion, because the offers of respecting language and religious practices are now already too late. I mean, that no one's going to accept that. And then it says, and if these people during the electoral democratic procedures, including during referendums, spoke out in favor of being part of the Russian Federation, this opinion must be respected. Okay, so now the opinion is respected, but still, that's kind of what the question was about. I mean, okay, so now they're going to be incorporated within the Russian Federation. This is democracy. I want to remind those who forget about it. And among other things, this is fully consistent with international law. I want to remind you of the first articles of the Charter of the United Nations, which directly states the right of nations to self-determination. Yeah, I mean, there is there is that. Um, the Charter of the United Nations is one of those things you can always find something there that helps your cause, because there's also the bit in the United Nations that about country respecting countries' sovereignty and territorial integrity. So if they have a vote in some part of a country, and then that part of the country secedes and joins another part of the country, or even if it just secedes and becomes independent, that violates another part of the United Nations Charter, which is the respect for the territorial integrity of UN member states. I mean, I'm not interested in litigating this. Um, the problem, I think, arises when Russians in particular start being talking in this very meticulous way, as if somehow you can, the Charter of the United Nations is absolutely unambiguous, and you can find, the a clear ruling on any particular matter, whereas there's plenty in the United Nations that are just simply self-contradictory, such as, well, this is obviously one example. Another example is that the prohibition on the use of force against, in all circumstances, with the exception of self-defense. That's fantastic. But then there's another part of the United Nations Charter that says, well, the UN Security Council can, however, order the use of force against a member state of the United Nations. So you always want to be careful before you embrace this as holy writ. Anyway, but we do not connect with one another, territories and security guarantees. Of course, one can say that these are closed topics, but we do not directly connect them. That is not how the question was raised during the discussion in Anchorage. Okay, so how was it? Okay. And then, as for possible meetings with Mr. Zelensky, I have already spoken about this. In general, I've never ruled out the possibility of such a meeting. Is there any sense in these meetings? Look, let's see. According to the Constitution of Ukraine, some may agree with it, some may not. You just need to read the text carefully. There are no ways to extend the powers of the President of Ukraine in the Constitution of Ukraine, none at all. He's elected for 5 years. 5 years have passed. That's it. The powers are over. Now, it's very interesting. If you read the Constitution of Ukraine, it doesn't say that the president's powers can be extended beyond his term of office. But neither does it say that he can't be. So it's true that it suggests that the Verkhovna Rada can be extended beyond its term in the event of martial law. It doesn't say the president. It doesn't say the president's term in office can be extended, but it doesn't say that it can't be extended. So the constitution is kind of doesn't, I mean, the Russians talk a lot about this Ukraine constitution. It's not immediately clear that um, that it can't be done. It doesn't say that it cannot be done. But above all, you can hold elections, whether it's martial law or not martial law. You can hold elections. There's nothing in the Constitution that says that you can't hold elections in the conditions of martial law. And I think that would be it seems to me like a stronger case you can make. And just say, look, there's no reason why Ukraine cannot hold an election. Zelensky's term in office has expired, and it's hard to see what the justification is to for him to just continue in office. It's now it's expired already quite a long time ago. But I don't think, going through the Constitution, that it's in any but in any reading of it, that it's a cut and dry case that that Zelensky cannot extend his term. It doesn't say he can't do it. It doesn't say he can do it, but it doesn't say that he can't do it. Anyway, but this is an extraordinary preoccupation on the part of the Russians about this constitution. And then he says here that blah blah. He's elected for 5 years. 5 years have passed. That's it. His powers are over. And then, according to the Constitution, you need to read the text carefully. There are no ways to extend the powers of the president of Ukraine in the Constitution. As I say, it doesn't say that you can't. I haven't seen any wording there that says that he can't extend it. I mean, doesn't say he can, doesn't say he can't. There's a provision according to which elections are not held under martial law. That's not. I didn't find that either. They passed legislation when in 2022 when they declared martial law. But this is legislation. It's not in the Constitution. So they passed legislation prohibiting the holding of elections under martial law. Okay, that's they can do that. I don't think that there's anything that violates the Constitution in simply postponing the elections, and I guess even postponing the elections indefinitely. Probably it's allowed under the Constitution. It says, yes, that's true, but that does not mean that the president's powers are extended. It means that his powers expire and his powers are transferred to the Speaker of the Rada. I don't think that's what it says. That's just anyway. What should the current authorities do then if they would want legitimate and fully participate in the settlement process? They must first hold a referendum in accordance with the Constitution of Ukraine on territorial issues. Any are decided only by referendum, as far as I can remember. But a referendum cannot be held under martial law. That is also a provision of the Constitution itself. So in order to hold a referendum, martial law must be lifted. But as soon as this is done, it is necessary to go to the elections, and this process will last forever. Now, I mean, I think that's a reasonable point to make. Well, you can lift martial law. You can absolutely lift martial law. I mean, there's no reason for it. and you can hold elections. There's no reason why you can't hold elections. You can hold a referendum. No reason why you can't hold a referendum. Um, but to be honest, I don't see the particular reasoning for it. If there's an election, um, there's a good chance that Zelensky might win. But okay, there's also a chance that he won't. But if he doesn't, he will be replaced by somebody um, probably more extreme than he is. In fact, I tend to think that from Russia's perspective, Zelensky is really their best bet because Zelensky, I don't think he believes anything. I think he's an opportunist, a grifter. Um, he kind of was ready to promise anything to get to be president back in 2019. I think, back in 2019, he was happy to promise to bring the war in the Donbass to an end. He was happy to promise to improve relations with Russia. And I think he meant it. Then he realized that this is going to be awfully difficult to achieve. And he changed his position and became belligerently anti-Russian. But I don't think that's something that comes naturally to him. I don't think he really has any strong beliefs. His rival Zaluzhny, I think, is a different case. I think Zaluzhny is a Banderite. I think he does believe in things. And I think if he were in charge, it's going to be much more difficult to deal with him than to deal with Zelensky. So I don't know now how the referendum would go, and that's an interesting question. But a referendum, it might go in favor of just let's end this war. We'll give up our territories and so on. Let's just end this war. But it might just simply go say, no, we're not going to give up any territory, and the war goes on. So there's just no guarantees on anything. There's election or referendum that they're going to go Russia's way. So that's why I just think that this whole thing is, to be honest, just a kind of a waste of time. I mean, I don't know why there's need to go into this whole discussion, which in any case is a Ukrainian matter. I mean, it's really up to Ukraine to decide whether they want to lift martial law, whether they want to hold election, whether they want to have a referendum, or whether they want Zelensky to go on being president. I really don't think Russia really needs to deal with this. Now, the whole issue of whether Zelensky has legitimacy is just, it's a totally pointless. If you're president, you're legitimate. That's it. I mean, there's no somehow a legitimate thing and non-legitimate. It's a waste of time. If you're president and you're recognized as president by the people, you're recognized as president by the international community or whatever that is, and you're recognized as president by your armed forces, then you're legitimate. It's a fairly obvious point that is legitimate. Is he democratically elected? No. Should he have held elections? Yeah. But that still doesn't make him non-legitimate. Of course he's legitimate. And if he signs an agreement, he will be legitimate. I mean, the idea that you can have this legalistic argument as to who's legitimate and who isn't, it's a total waste of time. I mean, it's like the people who during the Cold War would argue that the Soviet regime is not legitimate. Well, why isn't the Soviet regime legitimate? Well, because there have been no elections in the Soviet Union. The one election that took place in 1918, the Bolsheviks lost. That was the last election the Bolsheviks lost. So therefore, the Soviet regime has no legitimacy. I mean, it was a stupid argument during the Cold War because however much you may dislike the Soviet regime, it obviously had legitimacy because it was the legal accepted government of the Soviet Union. The people on the Soviet Union, they may not have liked the Soviet regime, they accepted it as the government, the authorities that they had to listen to, who provided them with all the documentation and so on. And this government was recognized by others as the government of the Soviet Union. The armed forces accepted that their leaders were the Communist Party apparatchiks. So that was legitimate. So I don't understand why there needs to be this arcane discussion as to who is the legitimate ruler of Ukraine. I mean, and as I said before, in particular, as if you were going to make that argument about legitimacy, that that horse has already left the stable. The time to have made that argument was in 2015, a year after the overthrow of Viktor Yanukovych, and the time, and then to say, oh, that's sorry about that. So a nice bit of background noise to give a kind of a vivid Budapest sound to this. So yeah, the time to have made that argument was with Poroshenko and say, look, we don't accept Poroshenko as the legitimate president of Ukraine because we consider the legitimate president of Ukraine to be Viktor Yanukovych. Well, then at least you could have made that argument because he had been overthrown in a coup, and then you could have said, well, we're not going to deal with any government in Ukraine other than that of Viktor Yanukovych. But since Russia didn't make that argument then, this is a very weak argument, a really weak argument that somehow, according to Ukraine's constitution, you can't extend the term in office of the president. I mean, what are you, the Constitutional Court of Ukraine? I mean, as I say, I looked at the Constitution and I said I didn't find anything there that said that a Ukraine president cannot extend his term in office. There's nothing there, and it's a pointless argument to get into. Anyway, let's just go on for a little bit more, and so he says the Rada commander in chief. What should the current? So then this person, we had looked at all that. The election result is unclear, but whatever the result, it is necessary to obtain the corresponding conclusion of the Constitutional Court afterwards. Well, how about we? I mean, it's like then you ask, what are you? Are you the Ukrainian Constitutional Court? I mean, this really is nothing to do with Russia. If Russia wants to negotiate with Zelensky, let them negotiate with Zelensky. If they don't want to negotiate with Zelensky, then fine, don't negotiate with Zelensky. Don't make this about constitutionals and laws and the courts. I mean, this is the worst kind of legalisms. It's just very unpersuasive. This is what is written in the Basic Law, but how can one obtain the conclusion of the Constitutional Court if after the authorities demanded that this Constitutional Court of Ukraine confirm the extension of the president's powers and he actually refused to do so? Do you know what they did in Ukraine? It's funny but true. The security stopped letting the chairman of the Constitutional Court into his workplace. All right? Then he goes, that's it, the movie is over, but not quite, because as far as I know, I don't know where he is now, but at one time he went abroad, so he's talking about this Constitutional Court. But in recent years, the powers of some members of the Constitutional Court have expired. It does not have a quorum to make decisions. Therefore, this is a road to nowhere. If you simply hold meetings with the current head of the administration, so to speak, carefully, It's possible. I've never refused it. So I mean, what is the point of all of this? I mean, I'm just you're listening to this, and just this is going nowhere. This doesn't add anything to anything. It's possible. I've never refused this. If this meeting is well prepared and will lead to some positive possible results, by the so this is exactly right. If there's a reason to meet Zelensky, then the meeting with Zelensky will take place. In other words, if there's a possibility that that a deal might be signed with with Zelensky to bring the war to an end, then yeah, they're going to meet him. I mean, if there's a serious possibility of something being signed, of course he's going to meet Zelensky. Like not going to be wasting his time on arguing about whether he's legitimate or not. By the way, Donald asked me, it's kind of strange to refer to him as Donald. Donald asked me if possible to hold such a meeting. I said, yes, it's possible. In the end, if Zelensky is ready, let him come to Moscow. Such a meeting will take place. And then he says, and the rest was not so interesting. So, I mean, the reason I wanted to highlight this is that, I frankly, I've always had doubts whenever the Russians, Putin, often Lavrov, a great deal, they start doing all these legalisms. They start talking about the UN Charter, what the international law is. Nobody cares, to be honest. It's something you bring up to win an argument. And then, if it helps your cause, you bring it up. If it doesn't help your cause, you keep quiet about it. But getting into these discussions about the UN Charter, I mean, there's a reasonable basis to bring it up if you want to win an argument, if you want to make a point about the destruction of Yugoslavia. Absolutely, you say, hey, this is the UN Charter, and go through all of the provisions of the UN Charter that the West violated in destroying Yugoslavia. There's an awful lot of them, and that's fine. But so what? I mean, has anyone in the West ever changed his position because their actions are in violation of the UN Charter? No one says, okay. I mean, it's like when George W. Bush, I think before the invasion of Iraq, he says, invading Iraq, that's a violation of international law. And says, oh, international law? Let me find some lawyers. And I think Madeleine Albright said something very similar. I mean, they just showed their absolute contempt. So I don't know what, everything that was done to Iran just, I guess, a few weeks ago was a complete violation of the UN Charter, a complete violation of international law. Okay, great. And now what? How, in what way are you helping Iran by pointing out that the attack on Iran was a violation of international law? And again, it wouldn't be difficult to go through the UN Charter and list all the different ways in which it was a violation of international law. Okay, but the fact is, Iran just had to sit on its hands and take the beating. And Russia wasn't able to do, for whatever reason. I'm not blaming Russia, but it didn't do much to help Iran. So, as I say, I think I just don't see much purchase in getting into these sorts of debates. The West really doesn't care very much about international law unless they can use it, against somebody. So they think, hey, we can use international law against Russia and Ukraine, but we can ignore international law when it can be used against us. Um, and anyway, Ahmadovich says here, George, Trump posted truth, one with him and Putin looking at the sky, watching a flyover, and the B 2 and F 35. This could be a message. Trump plans to escalate and is threatening something. Well, I agree. And I think that's what Trump wants to convey by posting such pictures. However, um, Trump is very good at this kind of bluster and these threats, and there's a limit to how much bluster and threats you can engage in without losing your credibility. So I'm not dismissing the possibility that he will escalate. In fact, I think it's quite likely because as things are going, he's really, this his peace plan and his objective of ending the war in Ukraine is going nowhere. I mean, he's going to realize he's going nowhere. Um, so I do think that he's trying to get something by threatening that he will escalate, and he may absolutely do so, but I don't think. But we'll just have to see. I mean, whether he does it, but at the moment, I think he's just blustering, and he's done that. He's really from day one. He's been issuing threats against Russia. Sooner or later, he may well make good on those threats. But um, this flyover, I think, was just a threat. Anyway, Donaki says they would agree to take Ukraine if they get their hands on the fertile black soil land exploited for themselves, which I think will actually happen, EU member or not. Yeah, no, that's right. Um, the problem is that there's just too many countries that have a problem with Ukraine, and we saw what happened when Ursula von der Leyen lifted the sort of the quotas on grain imports from Ukraine. I mean, she's supposed to be protecting the farmers of the EU, and just in order to commit herself to the cause of Ukraine, she lifted the quota limit on Ukraine imports, and so suddenly the EU market was flooded with Ukraine grain. Well, that will cause a protests everywhere, protests in Hungary, protests in Poland, protests in Bulgaria and Romania. So it's going to be a problem, in getting Ukraine in, and it's a basket case. I mean, this is after a war. I mean, imagine how much money will need to be poured into Ukraine to get it up to any kind of EU standard. So I tend to think that this is the EU version of what Trump is doing. It's a lot of bluster. Oh yeah, absolutely. We're going to get you into the EU. The door to the EU is open, um, but it's not going to happen anytime soon. Anyway, thank you very much. I think my time is up. Thank you everybody who joined me, even though I'm not in the best of health, just the allergy season. Thank you everybody who made so many interesting comments and questions and observations. Couldn't get to everything, but thank you, appreciate that. And we're going to be thank you above all to those who contributed to the tip jar and therefore contributed something to improving the mood of the dogs, which has been very dark. As the days are getting increasingly dark, their mood is getting dark, and they spend too much time grumbling about the state of the tip jar, always taking it out on me. But thank you for that. We're going to do some more podcasts on the over the weekend, and then of course we have the live stream with Peter on Monday, and then my solo Tuesday at the same time. I hope to see you all then. Until then, thank you. Good night. See you soon. All the best. Bye bye.